They came, offering peace. What they brought was chains, and when the humans were betrayed, they didn't beg, they bled. This is not just a rescue mission. This is retribution. The diplomatic fleet cut through the void of Tarner system, 6 ships carving a path into hostile silence. At the forefront, the uprising, a sleek diplomatic cruiser, led the way, flanked by 5 escort vessels built for endurance, not battle. Their hulls gleamed against the distant glow of Tarnth, the system's capital, a world of jagged mountains and deep valleys. Its barren surface stretched endlessly beneath the fleet's silent approach. They weren't announced, but they were expected. Inside the uprising's command deck, Ambassador Rin stood rigid, hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on the planet below. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of his mission pressed against his ribs. The Vorkesh had extended an invitation, an act unheard of, a species known for their isolation suddenly reaching out. The United Earth Defense had taken notice, and now Rin was here to find out why. A flickering console drew his attention, a subtle shift in the ship's status. Sir Lieutenant Bradley called from communications. "We just lost connection with the relay beacons. Main comms are down." Rhine turned sharply. "That's not possible. It just cut out mid-transmission." No interference detected, no external jamming signals. Bradley leaned over the console, his brow furrowed. It's like the whole system went dark at once. A second officer at Tactical stiffened. "Something's breaking orbit. Sir." Multiple contacts, big ones. Before Rin could respond, the entire viewport was swallowed by the emergence of shadows. Massive ships unfurling from the obscurity of Tarnth's gravity well. Their hulls were black and angular, and unmistakably alien. A fleet, and not Vorkesh Zarns. The bridge erupted in controlled chaos. Status reports flooded the deck as the fleet materialized in staggering numbers. They hadn't just arrived. They had been waiting. Rin's pulse quickened. Full spectrum scan. Now the sensor officer's response was immediate, but grim. "We're completely surrounded, 30. No 40 ships, cruisers, battleships. A command dreadnought holding position in low orbit." They were already in system, using the planetary mass to conceal their approach. Cold realization settled over the crew like a suffocating shroud. They were trapped. A sharp chime cut through the rising tension. An incoming transmission. "Put it through," Rhine ordered. The main screen flickered, revealing a figure draped in the imposing crimson battle cloak of the Zarn warlord. His segmented, chitinous skin caught the light in faint iridescent streaks, a natural exoskeleton that shifted with every movement. His elongated skull lacked a nose with deep-set black eyes positioned at an unnatural angle. 2 thin, flexible tendrils extended from his jawline, twitching as he spoke, subtly mirroring his amusement. "Ambassador Rin." The Zarn purred his voice a low growl. "I see the Vorkesh neglected to mention we would be here to greet you." Rin's jaw tightened. "Don't believe we were expecting such hospitality." Warlord Drav chuckled, turning his head slightly as if addressing unseen figures off-screen. "Do you hear that? Vorkesh. He didn't expect us." His tone was thick with mockery. "Perhaps you should have been more forthcoming with your guests." The screen shifted slightly, revealing a row of Vorkesh dignitaries standing in rigid silence behind the warlord. Their slender, sinewy faces were lined with deep-set eyes and elongated angular features. Their ears, sharp and slightly curved back, twitched with rest. Blushy had tension. Their skin, a muted shade of ash gray, seemed almost translucent under the dim light, and their elongated fingers tipped, with delicate but firm claws flexed subtly, betraying their unease. None of them spoke. Rin's stomach turned. He knew what this was. The Vorkesh had surrendered. Your fleet is now under Zarn custody. The warlord continued, his tone almost conversational. Lower your shields and prepare for escort to the surface. Any resistance will be met with immediate force. Rin weighed his options. None were favorable. His eyes flicked to the tactical readout. The Zarns had already moved into a tight formation around them. Precision maneuvered to account for every possible escape vector. The escort ships barely had the firepower to engage a single cruiser, let alone a fleet. The Vorkesh had betrayed them, but the Zarns weren't satisfied with that alone. They wanted something else. A show of submission. A slow breath steadied his nerves. We will comply. The uprising and its escorts descended into Tarnth's atmosphere, flanked by Zarn warships. The descent was silent, tense. As they breached the clouds, the cityscape below stretched across the valley floor in sprawling industrial complexes and towering citadels. But the banners that should have flown Vorkesh colors were gone, replaced by the sharp insignia of the Zarn Imperium. The Vorkesh had already fallen. The landing sequence was tight, military in precision. The moment the ships touched ground, the Zarn swept in like carrion birds. Rin stepped off the uprising's ramp, flanked by his aides, and a small detachment of UED Marines, led by Captain Kai. His posture was rigid, his sharp gaze scanning the perimeter with the practiced eye of a man who had walked into ambushes before. The air was thick with tension. The landing platform ringed with Vorkesh officials, standing awkwardly beside a perimeter of Zarn soldiers. The warlord from the transmission stood waiting, his lips curled in amusement. A wise choice, Ambassador. You make this transition much simpler. Rhine ignored the provocation, his gaze shifting to the Vorkesh leader, standing at the forefront. A tall figure clad in ceremonial armor, dulled with age, his once proud stance marred by the weight of his decision. Rhine took a step forward. Tarn. I assume. The Vorkesh leader's jaw clenched. His gaze flickered downward, Ambassador. A flicker of something unreadable passed between them. Regret, resignation. Rin inhaled deeply. This is a mistake. Tarn's throat bobbed, but before he could speak, the warlord's segmented fingers tightened around his shoulder, the faint rasp of chitin scraping against fabric, sending a shiver through Tarn's frame. Enough with the pleasantries, the Zarn murmured, his grip possessive. Your role in this matter is over. Tarn. Rhine clenched his fists. Your demands have been met. You have what you wanted. Let my people go. Zivan's laughter was soft, almost pitying. Oh, Ambassador, it is not that simple. A sharp command rang through the platform in the guttural tongue of the Zarn's soldiers, surged forward, overwhelming the UED detachment before they could even raise their weapons. Marines were wrestled to the ground, diplomats seized by armored hands. Rin's breath caught as he was wrenched backward, his arms locked in an iron grip. Captain Kai moved on instinct, but before he could even draw his sidearm, 3 Zarn soldiers seized him, twisting his arms behind his back with brutal efficiency. He struggled for only a moment before stilling, jaw clenched, his eyes burning into Sivarn's impassive gaze. "Consider this a precaution," the warlord murmured. Stepping closer, his slit-pupilled eyes alight with amusement. The Vorkesh thought. Surrender would spare them. They were mistaken. He leaned in slightly, his tone dropping to a whisper. "Let's hope you prove more useful than they did." Rin's vision blurred as he was forced to his knees. Around him, his people were dragged toward waiting transports. He caught one last glimpse of Tarn still standing, still, silent, his gaze fixed on the ground, a prisoner in his own world. The transport doors slammed shut, cutting off the last sliver of light. Inside, the transport darkness settled thick, heavy, with a scent of sweat, blood, metal. The air was stale, each breath carrying the weight of captivity. A low hum pulsed through the floor beneath them, the steady rhythm of the engines broken only by the distant murmur of Zarn guards beyond the reinforced walls. Shackles dug into raw skin, each dull ache, a quiet reminder. They were prisoners, and their fate was no longer their own. Captain Kai kept his breathing steady, though every muscle in his body screamed for action. The Marines seated around him, those who had survived the initial subjugation, sat rigid, their faces shadowed under the dim emergency lighting. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The transport jolted as it docked, the sudden deceleration, sending a ripple of tension through the prisoners, a hiss of hydraulics, then a metallic clang as the hatch groaned open. Blinding light flooded the chamber, forcing Kai to squint as silhouettes moved against the brightness. A guttural voice barked. Zarn guards stomped inside their tall exoskeletal frames, moving with unnerving synchronicity. Their weapons gleamed under the sterile light, their elongated skulls twisting as they scanned the prisoners like livestock. One of them, bulkier than the others, strode forward and grabbed Kai by the collar of his tattered uniform, yanking him to his feet with inhuman strength. "You're first," the creature rasped. Kai clenched his jaw but did not resist. The others were forced to their feet, some shoved forward with cruelty, others dragged for hesitating a second too long. They were herded down a series of tunnels, the metallic corridors illuminated by the pulsing glow of embedded conduits. The path splintered into multiple ways, and soon Kai found himself separated from the diplomats and engineers. He cast one last glance toward Ambassador Rin, who was shoved in the opposite direction alongside his advisors. The older man met his gaze briefly, the silent exchange saying more than words could. Then they were gone. Kai and the remaining Marines were led through a reinforced threshold. The air changed, hotter, thicker. Then the noise, cheers, snarls. The unmistakable sound of flesh striking flesh. The arena. Kai's stomach twisted. He had heard of these Zarn rituals, of the brutal spectacles they indulged in. He had never imagined he would stand inside one. The walls of the Colosseum stretched high above a jagged cathedral of stone and steel. The audience, Zarns of varying ranks and castes, filled the upper terraces, their guttural growls of anticipation echoing through the air. Below them, the pit was coated in dark stains, and at its center, a corpse. Kai's hands curled into fists. The guards shoved him toward the gate leading into the pit. "You fight." Now one sneered. Kai turned his head slightly, voice steady. "And if I refuse?" A brutal strike to the ribs answered him. He gritted his teeth as pain flared through his side, but he didn't stagger. Another blow, this time to the back of his knee. He dropped, breath catching as he hit the dirt. "You fight, or you die on your knees, like the last one." The Zarn spat, gesturing toward the body. Kai forced himself up, shaking off the pain. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of watching him struggle. A heavy gate groaned open, and across the pit another warrior emerged, Zarn, clad in sparse, battle-plating blades extending from its forearms. The crowd roared. Kai exhaled slowly. The fight began. Elsewhere in the Zarn stronghold, Ambassador Reen sat rigid in a confined chamber, wrists bound to the chair before him. The chamber was stark, the only feature of note being the massive viewport overlooking the labor yards. He could see them, his people stripped of their uniforms, pressed into servitude. Engineers bent over dismantled earth vessels, their hands covered in grease and burns as they tore apart their own technology. Armed guards paced between them, quick to punish any sign of defiance. "You can stop this," a voice murmured. Ryan didn't turn. He knew who it was. Warlord Drav stood behind him, his tone disturbingly calm. "Your people resist, but that resistance is meaningless. You have no fleet, no leverage. What you see below will continue until there is nothing left of them." Ryan closed his eyes for a moment. "What do you want?" he asked. Drav circled slowly, his talons clicking against the floor. "A message. From you to your people. Encourage their surrender. Persuade them to give themselves to the Imperium. The humans have spirit. Yes, but spirit can be broken." Ryan let the silence stretch. "And if I refuse?" Drav's mandibles clicked in amusement. "Then you will watch them suffer." The warlord gestured, and the viewport image shifted. A new section of the complex came into view. An enclosed pit. An arena. Reen's stomach turned as he saw it. The blood-stained floor. The figures locked in combat. Then he saw him, Kai-beaten, bruised, but standing. Fighting. Ryan's throat tightened. "Speak, Ambassador," Drav murmured, leaning closer. "Or they will all die." Beneath the Zarn fortress in the depths of the industrial sectors, Tarn stood at the edge of a steel balcony, gazing down at his people. What remained of them? The Vorkesh were workers now, their resources stripped, their sovereignty reduced to a hollow pretense. They had surrendered to survive, but survival had not come. The Zarns had not kept their word. Tarn's claws gripped the railing. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Chancellor." He turned, his advisor. Drav stood at his side, her violet-hued eyes flickering with uncertainty. "They will not stop," she whispered. "You see it, don't you? They will take everything." Tarn let out a slow breath. "Yes." Drav's voice wavered. "Then why do we remain silent? Because we are afraid." He did not say it. Instead, his eyes moved toward the labor yards where human and Vorkesh worked side by side, both under the same chains. For the first time, he saw them not as separate peoples, but as allies in the pit. Kai stood over his fallen opponent, chest heaving. The Zarn warrior groaned, but did not rise. The crowd above jeered, dissatisfied that the fight had ended too quickly. Kai lifted his gaze toward the high balcony where Drav stood. Their eyes met. Then the gates opened again. Another opponent, he thought. Kai exhaled, vision swimming. His ribs throbbed from countless blows, his arms trembled under exhaustion, but he forced himself to stand. Not yet, not yet. He would endure, because he wasn't done fighting. Then the guards seized him, yanking him toward the exit. Captain Kai sat against the cold wall of his cell, exhaustion weighing on him, his breathing steady, despite the dull ache spreading from his ribs. The last fight had nearly killed him. The next one probably would. He could hear the low murmurs of the other prisoners, humans and Vorkesh alike, scattered across the dimly lit chamber. Some whispered in hushed tones. Others simply sat in silence, their gazes hollow. Kai had learned to ignore the despair. Despair got men killed. A shadow moved at the far end of the cell. Kai's gaze flicked up his instincts, sharpening despite his fatigue. Tarn stepped forward, his tall frame tense with something unreadable. The Vorkesh Chancellor had avoided him since the capture, offering only brief glances during forced assemblies. Now he approached with clear intent. Kai didn't rise, but his expression hardened. "Took you long enough." Tarn exhaled slowly, his voice low. "You do not trust me," Kai scoffed. "You gave us up." The Vorkesh leader's features tensed, but he did not look away. "And you still breathe." Silence stretched between them. Then Tarn crouched, lowering his voice further. "I was wrong. I thought was saving my people. I'm sorry." Kai studied him, gauging the weight behind those words. He had seen broken men before, prisoners who realized too late the nature of their captors. Tarn's expression wasn't one of surrender. It was one of determination. The Vorkesh's violet-hued eyes flicked toward the guards at the far end of the room. "I need your help." Kai let out a slow breath, his fingers curling into fists. "You've got my attention." The labor yard was a sprawling nightmare of metal and rust. Human engineers and Vorkesh laborers moved between gutted ships, their hands blackened with oil and plasma burns. Armed Cytherian sentries patrolled the catwalks above their elongated skulls, tilting with predatory awareness. Buried within the chaos, a group of human technicians worked at the stripped-down remains of the Uprising's secondary comm station, their hands stripping away hull plating, rerouting circuits, doing what they were ordered to. But beneath the surface, something else was happening. Kai moved with careful, measured steps through the labor pits, a deep hood pulled over his face to mask his injuries. Tarn walked beside him, his posture stiff, his claws hidden within the folds of his tattered robes. "This won't work," Tarn muttered under his breath. "The security protocols." Kai cut him off with a glance. "Then we make it work." They wove through the debris, careful to keep their movements slow, unassuming. A technician. Greaves a man. Kai, barely recognized from the fleet's engineering crew, lifted his head as they approached. "Captain." He breathed, voiced tight with exhaustion. "You shouldn't be here." Kai didn't waste time. "Tell me you still have access to the emergency channels." Greaves swallowed his gaze, flicking toward the nearest guard post. "They're monitoring everything." "I don't need everything," Kai replied. "Just enough." Tarn shifted, lowering his voice. "The planetary relay system. It's old, unstable. There's a fraction of a second between transmissions where data is unchecked." Kai turned back to Greaves. "Can you use that window?" The engineer hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Maybe, but it won't be much." Kai didn't need much. Greaves wiped the sweat from his brow and turned to the exposed panels aside him, his fingers moving quickly over the interface. A soft hum filled the air as the system powered up its internal diagnostics, flashing in sporadic bursts. 10 seconds. Greaves muttered. "That's all you get." Kai's breath steadied. Greaves tapped the final command, and a single green light pulsed to life, ready. The console blinked once, then again. The green light flickered and held. The message was sent. For the first time in days, Kai felt something foreign settle in his chest. Hope. Then the clang of metal shattered the moment. The nearest Zarn sentry turned his black eyes, narrowing. Kai's stomach dropped. "Move," he hissed. Tarn was already in motion, his long strides blending seamlessly into the chaos of the laborers. Greaves shut the panel in one fluid motion, his hands returning to his work as if nothing had changed. Kai barely made it 5 steps before the first blow landed. A sharp blow struck the back of his skull, sending him staggering to his knees. His vision blurred, static dancing at the edges. A second strike to his ribs, then another. Tarn reached for him, but Kai shook his head, willing him away. The guards were on him in seconds. Rough hands wrenched his arms behind his back, dragging him forward. He barely caught a glimpse of Tarn being seized as well before his own world was swallowed by pain. Thousands of light years away in the war room of the United Earth Defense. The encrypted transmission illuminated the main display. Admiral Kyle leaned forward, his hands resting against the cold steel of the strategy table. The room around him was silent, only the soft hum of data feeds filling the void. His eyes narrowed as the message scrolled across the screen. Kai's voice came through low and steady. Fleet. Captured Zarns threaten to destroy the Vorkesh system. Do not trust their signals. Awaiting response. Kai. The silence in the war room shattered. Advisors murmured. Officers exchanged sharp glances. A technician at the far end of the chamber looked up from his console, awaiting orders. Kale exhaled slowly, straightening his shoulders. They're alive. Rear Admiral Drex, standing at his flank, folded his arms. That message confirms what we suspected. The Vorkesh didn't send that invitation. The Zarns did. A younger officer. Lieutenant Mira adjusted her earpiece. We've intercepted no distress signals from the Vorkesh homeworld. Official channels still show cooperation. Kael's jaw tightened. Because the Vorkesh aren't the ones in control. A slow breath filled his chest. This changed everything. An attack was no longer an option. A frontal assault would result in planetary genocide. The Vorkesh reduced to nothing more than collateral damage. The Zarns had designed this trap well, but Kai had given them something valuable. A warning. Kyle turned toward Drex, his voice sharp, decisive. We need a response. Now Drex arched his brow. Orders, sir. Kale's gaze turned back to the screen. A single thought settled in his mind. Hold on, Kai. We're coming. Inside United Earth. Defense Command. Screens pulsed with fleet movements, tactical projections, and decrypted intelligence from the Vorkesh system. Amid the controlled chaos, Admiral Kyle stood with arms crossed, eyes locked on the main holomap. An assault is off the table, Kyle said, his voice sharp. A direct engagement gives the Zarns exactly what they want. A reason to wipe out the Vorkesh, and they will. We don't know how, but we know they're prepared for it. If we don't act now, we may not get another chance. Rear Admiral Drex, standing to his right, nodded. A full-scale attack would be walking into a massacre. He gestured toward the data streaming across the screens. They've locked down the system. Anything that looks like a threat, they'll respond immediately. We need something they won't see coming. Kale's jaw clenched. He turned toward the main display where Tarnth, the Zarn-occupied heart of the system, was projected in stark detail. The primary power relays for the planetary detonation systems were buried beneath the surface, linked to an orbital command platform floating above the capital. If triggered, the Vorkesh were doomed. A soft chime signaled a new data input. Lieutenant Mira, stationed at the intelligence console, spoke up. Sir, our analysts have decrypted Vorkesh communications from before the occupation. They initially requested human support when the Zarn fleet arrived. That request was never answered. Hale exhaled slowly. So we give them their answer now. Drex frowned. You're suggesting we send a fleet as if we're responding to that original request. Not a fleet, Kyle corrected. A small force, just enough to look like reinforcements. They need to believe we're walking in blind. A beat of silence. Then understanding dawned. Blashiha leaned forward. If we keep it small, no dreadnoughts, no heavy warships, they'll assume we're exactly what we appear to be. Humans who don't realize what they've walked into. Kyle nodded. We make them think we're bringing in additional humans for subjugation, just as they've already taken. While their attention is locked on the new arrivals, we deploy infiltration teams to the orbital command platform. We need to know what the Zarns are using to keep the Vorkesh under control. Once we have answers, our other teams will move to neutralize the threat. Whatever it is. A silence followed. Then Drex let out a sharp breath and straightened. It's a long shot, but it's our best one. Kyle turned to his officers. Move. We don't have time for second guesses. The order rippled across the command center, and within minutes, Operation Troy was set in motion. After a few hours, the Argus dropped out of warp at the edge of the Vorkesh system, followed closely by 3 escort frigates. They were small, lightly armed, just enough to pose as a genuine diplomatic detachment on the bridge. Captain Lex adjusted his stance, watching as the system's defense grid came alive. Zarn warships lurked in the asteroid belts and upper orbit, their positions carefully concealed until now. They had been waiting for something like this. Incoming hail, Lieutenant Donner called from communications. Zarn command. Lex took a slow breath before nodding. Patch it through. The screen flickered and a familiar predatory face appeared. Warlord Drav. His black eyes gleamed with amusement. Humans. I was beginning to think you had abandoned your allies completely. But here you are, ever so eager to march into the mouth of the beast. Lex kept his expression carefully neutral. The Vorkesh requested reinforcements. We're here to provide them. Drav tilted his head. Of course you are. A pause stretched between them. Lex knew the warlord was weighing his options. If the Zarns had any real doubts, they would have fired already. Instead, Drav smirked. Lower your shields. Prepare for inspection. Lex kept his posture neutral, but his fingers twitched at his side. They were balanced on a knife's edge. If Drav hesitated for even a second too long, the plan was dead. The silence stretched. Drav's black eyes studied the human ship, unreadable. Then finally he exhaled. Acknowledged. Lex said evenly. The Argus and its escorts powered down their shields, allowing the Zarn ships to encircle them like hungry beasts. From the outside, it looked like a routine processing of another batch of naive human captives. Inside the Argus, however, the real mission had begun. Deep within the ship, Lieutenant Commander Zev checked the final sequence on his wrist console. The infiltration teams were in position. Dressed in Vorkesh-made armor, scavenged from past conflicts, they moved with practiced coordination, their equipment modified to mimic the signatures of local supply drones. The moment the Zarns docked for their inspection, the teams would deploy, some slipping into the planet's infrastructure, others preparing to board the orbital platform. 5 minutes to breach. Zev murmured into his comm. Across the squad final, weapons checks clicked into place. The mission was simple. Infiltrate the orbital command platform and uncover how the Zarns were keeping the Vorkesh in submission. If they failed, any attempt to liberate the system could result in catastrophic losses. Zev clenched his jaw. Failure wasn't an option. Aboard the orbital command platform, the Zarn overseer tilted his head as he scanned the approaching human vessels. Something didn't feel right. The escort ships were too clean, their movements too rehearsed. The Vorkesh had sent their distress call weeks ago, and now out of nowhere, the humans had arrived conveniently unaware of the Zarn occupation. He tapped a clawed finger against his control panel. "Increase surface surveillance," he ordered. "Scan for anomalies." His lieutenant hesitated. "Our jammers are active. If they try anything, we'll detect it immediately." The overseer's eyes narrowed, and if they already have. Below the surface of Tarnth, the first infiltration team emerged from a concealed maintenance hatch. The tunnels beneath the city were tight, damp, the air thick with the metallic scent of rusted pipes and coolant leaks. Two Vorkesh workers glanced up their large eyes, widening in shock, before their gazes flicked to the unfamiliar figures moving with them. Zev stepped forward, keeping his weapon lowered, but his stance firm. "We're not your enemy. We need access to the relay station." The Vorkesh hesitated, their expressions clouded with uncertainty. One of them, an older technician, studied the human team before nodding. "I don't know if you are enemy, but I know you're not." "Zarn. Follow me." Zev gestured his squad forward. They moved like shadows. The relay station towered ahead, its massive structure embedded within the cavern wall. The Vorkesh technician approached a data terminal. Then he froze. A security lockout flashed red across the screen, cycling through encrypted commands. The Vorkesh's throat tightened. The interface was wrong, sharper, blocky text, instead of the smooth script of Vorkesh systems. "This isn't ours." Zev's eyes narrowed. "Explain." The Vorkesh swallowed hard, his voice dropping to a whisper. "This isn't just a relay hub. The Zarns have tied their entire planetary security system into this network. If they're controlling anything, fleet movements, containment orders, worse, this is where they're running it from." Zev's earpiece buzzed. "Entry point." "Secured," came the whisper from the second team, already making their way to the orbital platform's power core. "Waiting for your go." Zev's fingers twitched over his rifle's grip, almost there. The relay station's encrypted commands scrolled across the Vorkesh technician's screen, the red lockout warning flashing ominously. Zev crouched beside him, rifle slung across his chest, his breathing slow and controlled. "Can you break it?" he asked. The Vorkesh technician hesitated for only a moment before his elongated fingers moved over the interface. Not in time. It's cycling through military-grade encryption, but if we sever the hardline connection to the orbital command, they won't be able to reactivate it remotely. Zev tapped his comm team too. Change of plans. Cut the station's physical link to the command platform. We'll handle the fail-safe here. A low voice crackled back. Understood. Moving now. Above the command platform, hovered in low orbit, oblivious to the silent war taking shape below. Within the Vorkesh detention center, an unnatural hush settled over the prisoners. Captain Kai flexed his fingers, feeling the raw ache in his knuckles. The bruises across his ribs throbbed with every breath, but the pain was secondary now. He had been waiting for something, anything to shift the balance. Then the security lights blinked. A sharp beep resonated from the guard's wrist displays. A guard at the far end of the corridor snapped to attention, his elongated head tilting as if listening to an incoming transmission. Another guard cursed in his guttural language and turned toward the control panel, his body tense with apprehension. Kai recognized the signs, confusion in the chain of command. disorganized orders. Something had changed. Then the cell doors clicked open. Kai's eyes darted to the locking mechanism beside his door. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. A split-second decision. He launched forward before the Zarn could react. Kai slammed into him, his shoulder ramming beneath the alien's ribs. A strangled grunt escaped the creature as Kai drove him into the cell, bars wrenching the plasma rifle from his grip. Without hesitation, he fired a single precise shot into the Zarn's throat, silencing him before the other guards could register the attack. The Vorkesh inside the cells pressed against the bars, eyes flicking between Kai and the stunned Zarn guards. Then from somewhere deeper in the prison, Kai heard distant weapons fire, the sound of boots pounding against metal floors. It was happening. The uprising had begun. A Vorkesh officer, older with sharp amber eyes, stepped into the hole, holding a rifle he had taken from a fallen guard. He exhaled sharply. They won't be unprepared for long. Kai tossed him another weapon from a nearby rack. Then let's not waste time. The Vorkesh caught the rifle and nodded. Behind him, humans and Vorkesh alike moved into the open, some with weapons taken from fallen guards, others scavenging whatever they could. Where are the others? Kai asked, wiping blood from his lip. Work camps enslaved. They won't have long. Kai exhaled sharply. Then we hit them first. Zev's comm buzzed, a Vorkesh voice whispered through the channel. The human prisoners are free. They're moving. Zev exhaled, tension leaking from his muscles. Confirmed, a burst of static. Then another voice. This time, human Zev. This is Kai. We're out, heading to the work camps. What's your status? A relieved smirk crossed Zev's face. About to shut these bastards down for good. The Vorkesh technician beside him severed the final connection to the command uplink. The relay station blinked, its system stuttering. A deep reverberating hum filled the chamber as secondary backups tried to compensate. Then static. Zev turned to his squad. The orbital command is blind. Let's make sure they stay that way. Explosions rattled through the tunnels. The fight had begun. Above, alarms blared through the Zarn command center. Drav's mandibles twitched in irritation. Status. A panicked officer replied, "We've lost contact with ground relay stations. Our security feeds are down." Drav's claws dug into the armrest of his throne. That's impossible. Another explosion shuddered through the station. Drav rose, his elongated frame tense. Find out who is responsible. A transmission broke through the static. Sir, human forces have escaped confinement. Vorkesh insurgents are aiding them. We're under attack. Drav's gaze darkened. So this was their plan. He turned sharply. Deploy suppression teams. I want every human and Vorkesh corpse at my feet by the hour's end. The work camps were a sprawl of rusted metal and heavy machinery. Zarn sentries patrolled the perimeter, their weapons lowered in the dull monotony of routine. That routine shattered the moment Kai's team breached the first security outpost. A Marine tore the sidearm from a fallen guard's belt and fired into the nearest enemy. Plasma fire erupted across the yard as human prisoners and Vorkesh laborers surged forward, overwhelming the distracted Zarn forces. Kai kicked aside a corpse and pulled a Vorkesh technician to his feet. Weapons. The Vorkesh, breathing heavily, pointed toward a stockpile near the guard barracks there. Kai motioned to his team. Secure it. Now, as the first wave of captives armed themselves, a Vorkesh soldier moved to Kai's side, his expression grim. This won't hold. They outnumber us. Kai reloaded his weapon. Then we make it cost them. Zev's squad. Reached the reactor chambers beneath the command platform. The room pulsed with raw energy, deep blue coolant lines running like veins through the reinforced metal. One Vorkesh saboteur tapped a console. Here, the overload fail-safe. Zev narrowed his eyes. Set it. We shut this down permanently. A dull alarm blared. Someone had noticed them. Zev turned to his team. Hold them off. This needs time. The Vorkesh worked quickly, bypassing security fail-safes. A deep hum resonated through the chamber as the system initiated shutdown protocols. A soldier behind Zev grunted as plasma fires seared past him. The fight had come to them. The streets of Tarnth were a war zone. Humans and Vorkesh fought in tandem, outnumbered nearly 30-1, but driven by sheer will. Sentry towers crumbled under sabotage charges. Zarn dropships poured reinforcements into the fray, but every street became a kill zone. Kai's pulse thundered in his ears as he cut through another Zarn line, his movements fueled by exhaustion and adrenaline. A Vorkesh warrior crumpled beside him, a plasma round burning through his side. Kai barely registered the kill before his hands were already moving, grabbing the downed soldier, hauling him upright. Not today. The fleet pierced through the void, their dark hulls slicing into the abyss, like predators slipping into a hunting ground. At the heart of the formation, the tier advanced a fortress of human engineering, its massive frame drinking in the faint glow of distant starlight. Flanked by 2 dreadnoughts and a full escort of warships, it moved with terrifying precision, its silhouette eclipsing Tarnth's dim horizon. On the bridge, Admiral Kael stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Around him, the crew operated in absolute focus, their movements efficient, their voices measured. A transmission pulsed across the encrypted channel, crackling through the command feed. Orbital command disabled. The Zarns are blind. The system is vulnerable. Kael exhaled tension, giving way to cold, calculated action. Then we don't give them time to recover. DG. He turned to his comms officer. Signal the fleet. All units engage. A low hum reverberated through the tier as engines flared to full power. Across the fleet, warships shifted into attack formations, their hulls cutting through the void with deadly intent. The battlefield was set. The system Tarner unfolded before them, its 3 occupied worlds bathed in the sickly glow of Zarn orbital platforms. The wreckage of past battles drifted through the void, silent testament to the Vorkesh's failed resistance. But today, the war was theirs to win. Kael straightened. Launch all squadrons. Weapons free. Within the central command bunker of Tarnth, alarms shrieked through the metallic holes. Warlord Drav's mandibles twitched in fury as red warning symbols flooded the holographic display before him. Insolent vermin. Then he hissed, his slit-pupiled eyes narrowing as he processed the unthinkable. The humans had arrived with a full battle fleet, no longer playing their pathetic game of diplomacy. A panicked officer turned his voice, strained. Exalted One. The orbital defense grid is unresponsive. We've lost access to our bombardment controls. Drav's talons slammed into the console, his chitinous fingers curling impossible. Another officer, his crest flattened in fear, barked a new report. Human and Vorkesh forces are advancing on multiple fronts. Resistance is collapsing in the city sectors, and a hesitation. What Drav snarled. "We've lost control of the planetary artillery systems." The detonators were severed. For the first time in the warlord's life, true rage clouded his vision. "Launch the fleet." His voice shook the chamber. "Crush them before they gain a foothold." Across the occupied system, Zarn warships broke formation from their hidden positions, converging into 3 massive strike forces. But it wasn't enough. Drav turned mandibles, clicking in barely contained fury. "Reduce 2 of the Vorkesh worlds to ash. Show them what defiance brings." A weapons officer hesitated. "Exalted One. Without the reactors. The bombardment cannons will take time to recalibrate." Drav lunged forward with terrifying speed, his talons clamping around the officer's throat. A sickening crunch echoed through the chamber as he snapped the officer's neck with a single motion. The lifeless body collapsed to the floor. The others stood rigid in fear. "Do it manually," he snarled. The first wave of Zarn ships surged forward. Human squadrons tore through their formations, deploying surgical strikes against weapons platforms and exposed command ships. On the bridge of the tier, Alton analyzed the battle hollow map. The Zarns were fast, but not coordinated. Their command chain was fractured, their reactions slower than expected. "Admiral, they're repositioning to overwhelm our center force," Drex reported. Alton nodded. "That's what I'd do too. But they're making a mistake." He turned toward his comms officer. "Signal the Peregrine and Spear. Have them feint a retreat. When the Zarns push forward, we cut their formation in 2. The order went through. The 2 human dreadnoughts began to pull back their formations, shifting. The Zarns, thinking they had momentum, rushed forward to exploit the weakness. The tier's spinal cannon fired. A beam of concentrated energy tore through the leading Zarn battleships, cleaving their vanguard in half. The shockwave sent smaller cruisers spiraling out of control, and before they could recover, human flanking squadrons descended on them like vultures. Alton's fist clenched. "Keep up the pressure." No mercy on Tarnth. The war was raging outside the buildings. The Zarns, realizing their plans were unraveling, turned their fury on the captured humans and Vorkesh. Across the labor camps, Zarn enforcers opened fire, indiscriminately cutting down anyone in sight. Vorkesh civilians scrambled for cover, while former prisoners fought with scavenged weapons. Kai ducked behind a collapsed transport plasma fire, searing the air above his head. "They're slaughtering everyone." A Vorkesh soldier beside him bared his teeth. "No more hiding." Kai's gaze hardened. "Damn right." He slammed a fresh charge into his rifle and motioned forward. "We push now. Into the control tower. Take out their command post." The resistance surged forward, humans and Vorkesh alike storming the Zarn positions. Explosions erupted as sabotage teams detonated fuel depots, sending Zarn dropships tumbling out of the sky. The once proud administrative sector of Tarnth was now a battlefield of smoke fire and bodies. A Zarn officer snarled orders into his communicator, only to be silenced as Kai put a bullet through his skull. "We take this sector. We take the city." Kai panted, shoving another plasma cell into his rifle. "And then we finish this." The sky above Tarnth burned. The wreckage of Zarn warships rained down in twisted molten fragments, leaving fiery scars across the once proud cityscape. Human bombers strafed enemy positions, hammering strongholds with military coordination, their payloads tearing through the steel and stone of Zarn fortifications. Below the streets were hell. Captain Kai moved like a man possessed, his rifle, searing red hot from continuous fire. Plasma bolts scorched the air around him, shattering concrete, burning through Vorkesh banners that had once signified subjugation. Now they were battlefields. He slammed into cover behind the remains of a transport, breathing hard. A Vorkesh soldier crouched beside him, reloading a scavenged Zarn rifle. "We're losing too many." The Vorkesh rasped, his pale blue blood streaking his armor. Kai's jaw clenched. "We hold." The Vorkesh warrior let out a bitter laugh, nodding toward the plaza ahead. The enemy wasn't breaking. Zarn troopers still held the last defensive perimeter around the command bunker, their heavy walkers turning the streets into kill zones. Gunships hovered low, laying suppressive fire over human and Vorkesh positions. Alike, Kai wiped the sweat and grime from his face. They couldn't hold like this forever. Above them, the sky burned white-hot. The mothership loomed in the void, its titanic form framed by the scattered remains of its fleet. Human cruisers and battleships encircled it, like wolves closing in on a wounded beast. On the bridge of the tear, Admiral Kyle watched its final desperate attempts to survive. The once dominant warship was now scarred and failing its shields, flickering its once impenetrable armor, now scorched and ruptured from relentless bombardment. Enemy capital ship showing heavy instability. Admiral Drex reported, "They're diverting power to engines. They're trying to run." Kael's expression remained stone cold. "Not today." He turned to his weapons officer. "Target their primary reactors, full barrage." The order rippled through the fleet. Within seconds, a hailstorm of tungsten slugs and plasma-tipped warheads crashed into the mothership's exposed hull, tearing through its structure like a knife through bone. On the Zarn bridge, alarms screamed, fires raged. Crew members abandoned their stations, desperately seeking escape pods, but there was no escape. The central spine of the mothership detonated a violent eruption of molten metal and plasma ripping through its core. One by one, its massive compartments buckled under the chain reaction, entire sections of the ship peeling away into the void. The bridge, once the brain of the fleet, was the last to go, its structure imploding before vanishing into a blinding cascade of fire and wreckage. The shockwave rippled through space, tearing through smaller vessels caught too close, their shattered remains joining the growing graveyard of the Zarn Armada. The remaining Zarn fleet, witnessing the destruction of their command, broke into chaos. They're retreating. One of the officers on the tier called. No Altin corrected. They're running. The Zarns, once so assured of their supremacy, were now leaderless and scattered. Their once imposing formations now nothing more than fractured clusters of desperate ships. Some tried to flee into deep space. Others, in sheer panic, charged blindly toward human warships, only to be obliterated by withering crossfire. The war was no longer a battle. It was a rout, but victory had come at a price. Across Vorakath, the bodies of human and Vorakesh fighters littered the ruins, their sacrifice etched into the burning skyline. Wounded soldiers staggered through the wreckage, their voices lost beneath the distant thunder of falling debris. There was no time to grieve, not yet. Deep within a hidden facility, Warlord Drav's mandibles twitched with fury and disbelief. The battle was lost. His fleet was in ruins. His army was crumbling. And yet he would not die here. His claws tapped a sequence into the console, overriding the security lockout on an unmarked hangar. Within a small advanced transport vessel powered up its systems, engaging in stealth mode. Drav turned once more to the holographic display, watching the last remnants. of his empire burn. The Vorakesh had betrayed him. The humans had humiliated him. This war was over, but the next one was already beginning. With one last venomous glare, he boarded the ship and disappeared into the darkness. The Zarn lines crumbled as the sky above Vorakath turned into a graveyard. The explosion of the mothership was visible even from the surface. A violent rupture of steel and plasma, its shockwave illuminating the heavens like a second sun. Zarn soldiers on the ground froze their reptilian eyes wide as they grasped the unthinkable. Their fleet was gone. A low, mournful hum rippled through their ranks, an instinctual reaction of an empire bred for conquest, suddenly stripped of its command. Some stood in stunned silence, their weapons slack in their hands, while others turned and ran, their combat discipline shattered. Then the sky darkened once more. It was the shadow of the Tear. The human dreadnought descended through the scorched clouds, its massive silhouette an omen of finality. The vessel hovered just outside the capital, a monstrous testament to humanity's resolve, its cannons idle but primed. The message was clear: surrender or be erased. The Zarns made their choice. The battle had shifted, and now it was no longer a fight. It was a run for survival. Kai pushed forward his boots, kicking up debris, as he stormed through the ruins of what had once been a Zarn command post. The Zarns were abandoning their positions, scrambling toward anything that could take them away from the battlefield. Kai saw dropships overloading with fleeing soldiers, some even killing each other to secure a place aboard. Others simply threw down their weapons and ran, their once imposing presence reduced to scattered, desperate figures. A Vorkesh fighter near him shifted his stance, his weapon lowering as he surveyed the disorderly retreat. "They're running," he murmured. Kai scanned the horizon. Fires still burned, the dead still lay where they had fallen, but the battle itself had passed its breaking point. The enemy wasn't fighting anymore. They were just trying to escape. "Hold your fire," Kai commanded. "Let them run." Some of the Vorkesh hesitated, their hatred for their oppressors still burning hot. The Zarn presence on Taernth had collapsed, but the cost had been unimaginable. The air was thick with smoke, the metallic stench of blood, and the charred remains of fallen buildings. The dead had no allegiances now. Kai lifted his gaze to the sky, watching as the last Zarn transport ships broke atmosphere, fleeing into the void like insects scattering from a flame. They would never return. Not after this. Far from the burning ruins of Taernth, deep within an abandoned Zarn outpost, Warlord Drav moved with calculated intent. His mind remained razor-sharp, unclouded by rage. Anger was for fools. He had not survived this long by clinging to pride over survival. The encrypted panel flickered beneath his clawed hands as he activated the stealth sequence on his escape vessel. A sleek, blackened transport powered up silent against the devastation unfolding outside. Through the viewport, he saw his empire in ruins. His mothership was gone. His armies were scattered, and yet his grip did not tremble. This war was not the end. As the transport's engines hummed to life, Drav sent out a single transmission, one that would echo across the Vorkesh frequencies and directly into the human battle network. A promise, humans. Vorkesh, this day belongs to you. But I will return. I will burn your worlds to the core. I will see your species undone. You have won a battle, but the war is far from over. With that, His transport vanished into the void. The dust had barely settled when the Tyr's landing craft touched down on Tarnth's scorched surface. Admiral Alton stepped onto the battlefield, the silence around him heavy with exhaustion and loss. Soldiers and Vorkesh alike gathered, some too wounded to stand, others too drained to react. Human Marines stood guard, weapons lowered but alert. Vorkesh warriors averted their eyes. The war was over, but its wounds ran deep. Through the battered remnants of his people, Chancellor Voraka stepped forward. His posture was not that of a leader greeting a victorious ally, but of a man burdened by regret. For a long moment he said nothing, then his voice, rough but steady, broke the stillness. "I was wrong." His gaze met Alton's. His expression weighted with the truth. "I only wanted to save my people. But we were wrong." He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not plead for understanding. He simply acknowledged what could not be undone. Alton studied him unreadable. Then at last he spoke. "I read the reports." His voice carried no anger, only the weight of reality. The Zarns weren't bluffing. They were going to wipe you out. His gaze swept over the ruins, the fallen, the cost of survival. "So as much as it pains me, all the lives lost today, human and Vorkesh alike, I cannot condemn you for doing what you thought necessary." Voraka held his gaze for a moment longer, then bowed his head. "We will never forget what the humans have done for us." His voice, though weary, carried the steel of something unbroken. "And when the day comes that you call for us, we will answer." The words hung in the air, a promise, written in blood and loss. Alton gave a single nod. No grand speeches, no declarations of victory. The war was over, but the future remained uncertain. Then the son of Tarnth sank over a battlefield that had no victors, only survivors. Smoke still drifted into the atmosphere. Cities lay in ruin. But amidst the wreckage, human and Vorkesh stood together, not as allies, but as those who had paid the same cost. And above them, in the endless dark of space, Sci-Fi was still out there, watching, waiting for the day the war would begin again.